video, we will discuss necessary and sufficient conditions, which is yet another way to frame implications. Now, I want to give some advice to everyone here. The words necessary and sufficient are words that we don't really use that often in our day-to-day lives. And so it's understandable that many students get confused between the two. They'll use necessary when they mean sufficient, and they'll use sufficient when they mean necessary. This is totally common. Please take my advice right now. You are going to want to dedicate the extra time to memorize when to use necessary and when to use sufficient properly. Hey everyone, real quick, I just want to mention that this video is a part of a whole course that I made. You can find a link to this entire course in the description below, and make sure to click on that subscribe button. So let's go through an example together where we use some of this phrasing. Let's rephrase the implication, if I dream, then I am asleep, in as many different ways as possible. So before we get to the converse, let's get to the original implication. So I can say, I am asleep if I dream. I could say, I dream only if I am asleep. We could say, in order to dream, I must be asleep. We could say, and this is where we use the word necessary, to dream, it is necessary that I am asleep. Again, to dream, it is necessary that I am asleep. Notice how we put the necessary with the asleep portion of this implication. It's really important you use necessary and sufficient properly. The next one, we're going to use sufficient. We're going to say to be asleep, it is sufficient that I dream. In this case, sufficient is attached to the hypothesis, the premise of the implication, whereas necessary is the conclusion. So the conclusion is necessary, the hypothesis, the premise is sufficient. And then last but not least, technically this is equivalent, but this is the contrapositive. I am not dreaming unless I am asleep. So that's another way we can phrase it. The following are equivalent to the converse. So this is where we pretty much just switch everything. So I dream if I am asleep. I am asleep only if I dream. And this is where we can use necessary and sufficient. It is necessary that I dream in order to be asleep. And we could say it is sufficient that I be asleep in order to dream. And then the contrapositive of this is if I don't dream, then I'm not asleep. So hopefully you agree with this example. I include the necessary and sufficient versions though, because those are common when discussing mathematics. In fact, let's agree once and for all what they mean exactly. So P is necessary for Q means Q implies P. P is sufficient for Q means that P implies Q. Again, sufficient means the premise, necessary means you're the conclusion. If P is necessary and sufficient for Q, then P and Q have this biconditional connective relative to each other. To be honest, I have trouble with these if I'm not very careful. I find it helps to keep a standard example for a reference though. Thinking about the necessity and sufficiency of conditions can also help when writing proofs and justifying conclusions. If you want to establish some mathematical fact, it is helpful to think what other facts would be enough or be sufficient to prove your fact. If you have an assumption, think about what must also be necessary if that hypothesis is true. Anyways, thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next lecture.